David Ray Griffin is a theologian and philosopher of international reputation. For much of his career, he taught at the Claremont Graduate University, where in 1973 he co-founded with John B. Cobb the Center of Process Studies, a research center in the Claremont School of Theology. In 1983, he founded the Center for a Postmodern World in Santa Barbara, and from 1987 until his retirement in 2004, he was the editor of a major series of scholarly monographs, the SUNY State University of New York series in constructive postmodern philosophy. He is himself the author, co-author, or editor of well over 24 books on philosophical and theological subjects. Since 2004, Professor Griffin has written a further, I hope I have the count right, 9 books assessing different aspects of the evidence relating to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and has co-authored or co-edited 2 other books on 9/11 issues. These books, together with his many public lectures and media appearances, have had a major international impact, helping to foster a growing awareness of the crimes and deceptions of 9/11. In 2008, his book, The New Pearl Harbor Revisited, was named a Publisher's Weekly Pick of the Week. And in 2009, The New Statesman named him one of the 50 people who matter today. Professor Griffin has been nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize. His most recent book, 9/11 10 Years Later, When State Crimes Against Democracy Succeed, was published on September 6, 2011. In this book, as Peter Dale Scott remarks, quote, he shows how over a decade the events of 9/11 and the reports on them have been used to attack the American democratic system. Above all, he documents the success of this attack by the refusal of the media, the academy, and religious institutions to openly discuss these matters, and by the numbers of critics who at one extreme have made fools of themselves in echoing the Orwellian official version, and at the other extreme have either been fired or silenced after their dissent from it, unquote. Professor Griffin's testimony today will be on the subject of anomalies of flights 77 and 93. Please welcome David Ray Griffin. Sorry, you don't want that? No, I don't. Okay.
Let's see. This morning I'm actually addressing the topic that was assigned, anomalies in the official accounts of American 77 and United 93. My subject is anomalies in those flights. By anomalies, I mean features in the official accounts of these flights that would not be expected on the assumption that these accounts are true.
Excuse me, Professor Griffin, for a moment. Is the audio not properly working?
I think it needs to point straight out. It needs to be a little higher. Yeah. Does that ruin the video? That's okay? Okay. Thank you. Part 1, American Flight 77. I begin with a question. Is the 9/11 Commission's new story about American 77 believable? One of the things that we would not have expected on the assumption that we have been told the truth about American 77 is that 3 years after 9/11, the original official story about this flight would be replaced with a radically different story. According to the original story, told in a press release of September 18, 2001, called NORAD's Response Times. NORAD was notified about American 77 at 9:24 that morning, roughly 14 minutes before the Pentagon was officially hit. This report raised a difficult question for the military. Why were the F-16s from Langley Air Force Base, about 130 miles away, not able to get to the Pentagon in time to prevent the attacks? Here, incidentally, I will ignore the question of why the Pentagon, surely the most well-protected building in the planet, had to rely on fighters from an Air Force base 130 miles away, when those fighters could have easily reached the Pentagon, and when there were always fighters on alert to protect Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon. Even if we accept the absurd idea that the Pentagon needed to rely on fighters from Langley, these fighters could have easily reached the Pentagon in 14 minutes. In their 2006 book, the co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission, Thomas Kane and Lee Hamilton, wrote, "If the military had had the amount of time they said they had, it was hard to figure out how they failed to shoot down the plane." The 9/11 Commission would avoid this conclusion by providing a new story, according to which the FAA had not told the military about American 77 at 9:24. In fact, the Commission claimed it never did notify the military until the Pentagon had been struck. There was, however, an FAA memo that went in the opposite direction. Rather than having notified the military about American 77 at 9:24, the FAA had actually notified it much earlier. This memo, written on May 22, 2003, was created in response to a request that day by the 9/11 Commission during a public hearing to clarify the FAA's notification of the military about the flights, especially American 77. This memo said, "Within minutes after the first aircraft hit the World Trade Center, the FAA immediately established several phone bridges that included the Department of Defense. The U.S. Air Force liaison to the FAA established contact with NORAD on a separate line. The FAA shared real-time information, including information about all the flights of interest, including Flight 77. NORAD logs indicate that the FAA made formal notification about American Flight 77 at 9:24 a.m., but information about the flight was conveyed continuously during the phone bridges before the formal notification." According to this memo, therefore, the military had been told about Flight 77 long before 9:24. During the 9/11 hearings the next day, the Commissioner, Richard Benveniste, read this memo into the record and said, "So we have in question whether there was an informal real-time communication of the situation, including Flight 77 situation, to personnel at NORAD. Our one military general, Craig McKinley, confirmed this point, saying that the FAA was indeed in contact with the military." Given the way this conversation was going, we might have expected the 9/11 Commission to have said that the FAA had told the military about Flight 77's troubles even before 9/24. So the military definitely should have been able to intercept the flight and prevent any attack on the Pentagon. But this is not how it went. Rather than saying that the FAA had told the military about this flight before 9/24, the Commission declared, NORAD's Northeast Air Defense Sector, never received notice that American 77 was hijacked. By making this assertion, the 9/11 Commission had to state that the military officers had given false testimony. The Commission said, in public testimony before this Commission in May 2003, NORAD officials stated that at 9:24, NAIADS received notification of the hijacking of American 77. This statement was incorrect. The 9/11 Commission complained that NORAD's original story, which had been repeated by generals during the 9/11 Commission hearings of 2003, had made it appear that the military was notified in time to respond, raising questions about the adequacy of the response. Those accounts overstated the FAA's ability to provide the military with timely and useful information that morning. Thus, the military did not have 14 minutes to respond to American 77, as testimony to the Commission in May 2003 suggested. This new official story of 2004 by the 9/11 Commission got the military off the hook for not preventing the attack on the Pentagon. But this new story is not believable for many reasons. I will give two. One reason is that the 9/11 Commission accuses the military leaders of telling an irrational lie. Here's why. If the Commission's new story, according to which the military was completely guiltless, were the truth, why would the military leaders have invented the original story, which implies that the military was guilty of standing down, or at least of incompetence? This would have been a completely irrational lie. The second reason why the Commission's new story is unbelievable is that it contradicts many previously established facts. I will give 4 examples. One is the FAA memo we've discussed. It stated that the 9/24 notification was wrong by being too late, not by being too early. The Commission dealt with this point by simply ignoring it, even though Richard Benveniste had read this memo into the Commission's records. 2, 4 days after 9/11, Matthew Wald of the New York Times published a story entitled, "Pentagon Tracked Deadly Jet But Found No Way to Stop It." This story said, during the hour or so that the American Airlines Flight 77 was under the control of hijackers, up to the moment it struck the west side of the Pentagon, military officials in a command center on the east side of the Pentagon were urgently talking to law enforcement and air traffic control officials about what to do. But the fighter planes that scrambled into protective orbits around Washington did not arrive until 15 minutes after Flight 77 hit the Pentagon. The 9/11 Commission dealt with this story by simply ignoring it. A third point is Indianapolis ignorance. The FAA's Air Traffic Control Center in Indianapolis was handling the flight when it started showing signs of being in trouble. The 9/11 Commission claims that the Indianapolis Center did not notify the military even when, at 8:56, it lost this flight's transponder signal, its radar track, and its radio. Why? Because the Indianapolis controller concluded the 9/11 Commission claimed that American 77 had experienced serious electrical or mechanical failure, after which it crashed. Why would the controller have made this conclusion at this time when it was known that 2 planes had already been hijacked, one of which had crashed into the World Trade Center? Because, the Commission claimed, no one at Indianapolis had any knowledge of the situation in New York until 9/20. But this claim strains credulity. Television networks had started broadcasting images of the World Trade Center at 8:48. These images included, at 9:03, the crash of the second airliner into the South Tower. Millions of people knew about these events. How can we believe that no one at the Indianapolis Center had any knowledge of the situation in New York until 9/20. General Mike Canavan, Director of Civil Aviation Security, told the 9/11 Commission, as soon as you know you had a hijacked aircraft, you notify everyone. The notification gets broadcast out to all the regions. Fourth point, military liaisons. The Commission's account, according to which the military did not know about Flight 77, is contradicted by the presence of military liaisons at the FAA's headquarters in Washington and its command center in Herndon. The Commission claimed that, although the fact that Flight 77 was lost was known at Herndon at 9:20 and at the FAA headquarters by 9:25, this knowledge did not get passed to the military. However, Ben Sliney, the operations manager at the command center, said, "At the command center is the military cell, which was our liaison with the military services. They were present at all of the events that occurred on 9/11. If you tell the military, you've told the military. They have their own communications web. Everyone who needed to be notified about the event transpiring was notified, including the military." The 9/11 Commission, of course, ignored this information. Conclusion: the 9/11 Commission's new story about Flight 77 is impossible to believe. This story rests entirely on the assumption that the so-called NORAD tapes, which the Pentagon gave to the 9/11 Commission in response to a subpoena, had not been doctored. But Philip Zelikow was a good friend of Stephen Cambone, the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, generally considered Rumsfeld's right-hand man. And there was plenty of time for the tapes to be doctored, as they were not delivered until a month after they had been subpoenaed. The suggestion that the tapes had been doctored is speculative, of course, but so is any suggestion that they had not been doctored. It should not simply be presupposed that the tapes, as delivered to the 9/11 Commission, provide the authentic military history of 9/11. The authenticity of the tapes must be evaluated in light of the total evidence, including the contradictions that I have just cited. Second major point, was the Pentagon attacked by al-Qaeda? It has been widely thought that the 9/11 truth movement is hopelessly divided about the Pentagon, how it was damaged. Some members believe that the Pentagon was struck by a Boeing 757, perhaps American Flight 77, while others believe that there was no 757. Some of those in the latter camp even suggest that those who believe that the Pentagon was struck by a 757, perhaps American 77, have endorsed the official story about the Pentagon. However, to focus on this contrast is to focus on a secondary issue. The primary issue is who is regarded as responsible for the Pentagon attacks. People who regard the Pentagon as struck by a 757, and perhaps even American 77, have endorsed the official theory only if they hold that the Pentagon was attacked by Flight 77 under the control of al-Qaeda. The crucial point in the official account is that the attack on the Pentagon was planned and carried out by al-Qaeda, not by our own military. Given this perspective, there is consensus in the 9/11 truth movement regarding the central issue about the Pentagon attack, because all members of the 9/11 truth movement hold that the Pentagon was not struck by American 77 under the control of al-Qaeda. I will illustrate this point with reference to a paper by Frank Legg and another paper by David Chandler and John Cole. Legg leans towards the 757 view, saying that it cannot be conclusively proved that no 757 hit the Pentagon. Chandler and Cole inclined to the American 77 view, saying that the physical evidence does not rule out the possibility that it was American Airlines Flight 77 that actually crashed into the Pentagon. I will drive home the consensus about the Pentagon by naming 6 points showing that Legg and Chandler Cole reject the official view of the Pentagon as fully as do people such as me who believe that the Pentagon was not struck by a Boeing 757. First, the Pentagon should not have been struck. The Pentagon was probably the most protected building in the world. Without some kind of stand-down order, it simply could not have been attacked, especially by amateur hijackers. Legg has articulated this point, saying the Pentagon should have been well defended. There was ample time to send up fighters to intercept, as is the normal procedure. Chandler and Cole ask rhetorically, how could the Pentagon, the hub of the U.S. military, have been so poorly defended that it could be hit after the buildings in New York City had already been hit and other hijacked planes were known to be still in the air? 2. According to the 9/11 Commission report, Dick Cheney entered the bunker under the White House, technically the POC, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, shortly before 10 o'clock, perhaps at 9:58. However, according to virtually all reports, including statements by Richard Clark and David Bohr, Cheney's photographer, Cheney had entered the POC closer to 9:15 a.m. The most important of these reports came from Norman Mineta, who was the Secretary of Transportation. In testimony to the 9/11 Commission, Mineta said that he arrived at the POC at about 9:20 a.m., shortly after which he overheard the ongoing conversation involving Cheney, which occurred during the time that the airplane was coming into the Pentagon. Mineta said, there was a young man who would come in and say to the Vice President, the plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? What were the orders? Mineta assumed, he said, that they were orders to have the aircraft shot down. But no aircraft approaching Washington was shot down. Mineta's interpretation also made the young man's question unintelligible, given the fact that the airspace over the Pentagon is categorized as forbidden, meaning that commercial aircraft are never permitted in it, plus the fact that the 2 hijacked planes had already crashed into the Twin Towers. The expected orders, if an unidentified plane were approaching the airspace, would have been to shoot it down. Had Cheney given those orders, there would have been no reason for the young man to ask if the orders still stood. His question made sense only if the orders were to do something unexpected, not to shoot it down. The most natural interpretation of Mineta's story, accordingly, was that he had inadvertently reported that he heard Cheney confirm stand-down orders. This interpretation would also make sense of what the 9/11 Commission did in response to Mineta's story. Its report did not mention Mineta's story, and its claim that Cheney entered the POC shortly before 10 o'clock meant that there was no time for the exchange with the young man described by Mineta. This portion of Mineta's testimony was also removed from the Commission's video archive. Mineta's testimony, combined with the 9/11 Commission's reaction to it, provides strong evidence, convincing to at least most members of the Truth Movement, that Washington insiders, including Cheney, were behind the Pentagon attack. Chandler and Cole ask, why was Norman Mineta's testimony about Cheney's response to the approach of the aircraft discounted in the 9/11 Commission report? Legg, calling Mineta's testimony crucial, wrote, there is little doubt that Cheney had it in his hand to block this attack on the Pentagon. 3. The official story is rendered especially dubious by its claim that the Pentagon was struck by a Boeing 757 flown by Al-Qaeda's Hani Hanjour. As the title of a New York Times story revealed in 2002, Hanjour, who had been taking lessons in a single-engine plane, was known as a trainee noted for incompetence, about whom an instructor said he could not fly at all. And yet on September 11, 2001, before Hanjour had been declared by authorities to have been the pilot of the plane that hit the Pentagon, a Washington Post story said, just as the plane seemed to be on a suicide mission into the White House, the unidentified pilot executed a pivot so tight that it reminded observers of a fighter jet maneuver. Aviation sources said the plane was flown with extraordinary skill. A Post story the following year stated, aviation experts concluded that the final maneuver, American Flight 77, was the work of a great talent. This was clearly impossible. A man who could not fly a single-engine airplane could not have flown a giant airliner with extraordinary skill like a great talent. Legg agrees that Hanjour's poor flying skills rule out the possibility that he flew a 757 into the Pentagon. Chandler and Cole ask rhetorically, how could an untrained pilot have performed the difficult maneuver? 4. Moreover, the extraordinary maneuver would have been so difficult in a 757 that the official story could not be saved by simply choosing a less incompetent Al-Qaeda trainee. Ralph Kolstad, who was a top U.S. Navy pilot before becoming a commercial airline pilot, has said, I have 6,000 miles of flight time in Boeing 757s and 767s, and I could not have flown it the way the path was described. If the maneuver could not have been executed by a 757, by one of America's top pilots, it could not have been executed by one of the alleged hijackers. It might be thought that this point would rule out the 757 view, but Legg is able to affirm this view with the possibility that the plane was hijacked by an onboard device, pre-programmed to take over the autopilot. And Chandler and Cole agree. 5. Al-Qaeda would have crashed into the roof. If Al-Qaeda masterminds had wanted only to strike the Pentagon, they would not have targeted Wedge 1, thereby requiring an amateur pilot to fly a trajectory that not even an expert professional probably could not have executed. The masterminds would have had the pilot simply crash into the roof, thereby having a 29-acre target. Chandler and Cole said that the plane was not flown by Al-Qaeda because if it had been, it would have simply dived into the building. 6. The targeting of Wedge 1 provides still more reasons to conclude that Al-Qaeda was not in charge. First, Al-Qaeda operatives would have wanted to kill the Secretary of Defense and top military officers, but their offices were as far from Wedge 1 as possible. Second, Wedge 1 was the only part of the Pentagon that had been renovated, making it less vulnerable to attacks. So an attack on Wedge 1 caused less damage than would have an attack on any other section of the Pentagon. Third, the renovation was not quite completed, so Wedge 1 was only sparsely occupied. Accordingly, whereas the attack on Wedge 1 killed 125 Pentagon employees, a strike on any other part of the Pentagon would have caused many more deaths. Surely that's what Al-Qaeda would have wanted. Summary. Points 4 through 6 show that the al-Qaeda mastermind behind the attack on the Pentagon would have been the stupidest mastermind conceivable. Put otherwise, the evidence shows that the Pentagon attack was not engineered by al-Qaeda. Conclusion. Members of the 9/11 Truth Movement have differing beliefs about what damaged the Pentagon, but they can and do have consensus on the fact that the Pentagon was not struck by American 77 under the control of al-Qaeda. A third and final point about American Flight 77. One of the best-known features of the official story of 9/11 is that Barbara Olson, a commentator on CNN and the wife of U.S. Solicitor General Theodore Ted Olson, made 2 calls to her husband from American 77 shortly before it struck the Pentagon. Ted Olson reported that the first call lasted about 1 minute, and the second one 2 or 3 or 4 minutes. The success of Ted Olson's reports is shown by the fact that virtually everyone, it seems, knows that the hijackers had box cutters, even though the reported Olson calls were the only phone calls from the planes in which box cutters, called cardboard cutters, were mentioned. In the first 5 years after 9/11, there were many reasons given as to why these reported calls from Barbara Olson were improbable, perhaps impossible, whether from cell phones or seatback phones. Then in 2006, the FBI, providing evidence for the trial of Zacarias Moussaoui, addressed both possible ways in which the calls could have been made. On the one hand, the FBI ruled out the possibility that Barbara Olson could have used a cell phone, saying all of the calls from Flight 77 were made via the onboard airphone system. On the other hand, the FBI report indicated that although Barbara Olson did attempt a call from a seatback phone, it was unconnected and therefore lasted 0 seconds. Not 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, but 0 seconds. This anomaly in the official account of Flight 77 has thus far not been mentioned by the mainstream press, with only, to my knowledge, one exception. Turning now to United Flight 93. I begin with the reported calls to Dina Burnett. The anomaly about the reported Olson calls provides a bridge to United Flight 93, because one of its distinctive features is that there were more reported phone calls from this flight than from the other flights combined. These reported calls are of great importance because it was the phone calls from the 9/11 planes that first convinced the public that America had been attacked by al-Qaeda hijackers. Evidence that these calls had been faked would therefore be of utmost importance. From the evidence in the previous point, it would appear that the Olson calls had somehow been faked. Strong evidence for fakery is also provided by the reported calls of Tom Burnett from United 93. His wife, Dina Burnett, reported that she had received 3 to 5 cellular phone calls from him. She knew that he was using his cell phone because the FBI report from that same day said Burnett was able to determine that her husband was using his own cellular telephone because the caller identification showed his number. This gives us another major anomaly. On the one hand, it seems impossible to dismiss Dina Burnett's testimony as based on either dishonesty or confusion. So we have no reason to doubt that her caller ID indicated that she was called from her husband's cell phone. On the other hand, cell phone calls from over 40,000 feet, United 93's altitude at that time, were, given the technology available in 2001, so unlikely that they can be called impossible. Even Dina Burnett herself, having been a flight attendant, wrote, "I don't understand how Tom could be calling me on his cell phone from the air." Indeed, even the FBI, in spite of having recorded on 9/11 that Dina Burnett had reported that her caller ID indicated her husband had called her from his cell phone, even the FBI stated in its report provided for the Moussaoui trial that Tom Burnett's calls were made from passenger seat phones. There would seem to be no escape from the conclusion that the calls to Dina Burnett, having not come from her husband flying at roughly 40,000 feet on United 93, had in some way been faked. And if one call was faked, this raises the likelihood that all of the reported calls were faked. Because if United 93 and the other 9/11 planes had really been taken over in surprise hijackings, no one would have been prepared to fake a single call. Second point. Another question about United 93 is when it showed signs of being in trouble. There were contradictory reports. In 2003, NORAD officials told the 9/11 Commission that the FAA reported a possible hijack of United Flight 93 at 9:16. But the 9/11 Commission in 2004 called this incorrect, saying instead, by 10:03, when United 93 crashed in Pennsylvania, there had been no mention to the military of its hijacking. The FAA controller in Cleveland had detected signs of hijacking at 9:28, even hearing, "We have a bomb on board." And yet Cleveland reportedly did not connect the military. The 9/11 Commission, trying to explain why not, gave an account of incompetence and even stupidity in the FAA, which is unbelievable. Besides being unbelievable, the 9/11 Commission's claim was contradicted by many prior reports. In his 2004 book, Richard Clark said that during his White House video conference, FAA Administrator Jane Garvey reported that at about 9:35, a number of potential hijacks, which included United 93 over Pennsylvania, had occurred. And this conversation occurred while both Donald Rumsfeld and General Richard Myers had been listening. The 9/11 Commission was able to claim that the military learned or was able to deny that the military had learned about Garvey's report by simply denying that Rumsfeld and Myers were involved in this video conference. An ABC program on the first anniversary of 9/11 had Karl Rove, David Borer, Cheney's photographer, and Cheney himself discussing the hijacked United 93 as having been considered the biggest threat. Brigadier General Montague Winfield, who had taken a leadership position in the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, recalled, "We received the report from the FAA that Flight 93 had turned off its transponder, had turned, and was now heading towards Washington, D.C. General Larry Arnold, the commander of NORAD's U.S. Continental Region, indicated in a January 2002 interview that the military learned about United 93's troubles between the crash into the second tower and the attack on the Pentagon. By this time, he said, we were watching United 93 wander around Ohio. He also said that at 9:24, our focus was on United 93, which was being pointed out to us very aggressively, I might add, by the FAA. This report by Arnold, who was involved in the events, differed radically from what the 9/11 Commission claimed. It's claimed that the FAA never contacted the military about United 93. The 9/11 Commission's claim was also, of course, incompatible with the testimonies mentioned earlier about the military liaisons. It seems impossible for us to say that what was really going on with United 93. But we can definitely say that the 9/11 Commission has given a false account. A third and final point. Did the military shoot United 93 down? Rumors that the military had shot down Flight 93 existed from the start. Major Daniel Nash, one of the pilots from Otis Air Force Base, sent to fly over New York City, reported that when he returned to base, he was told that a military F-16 had shot down an airliner in Pennsylvania. This rumor became sufficiently widespread that it came up during General Richard Myers' confirmation interview with the Senate Armed Service Committee on September 13th. Chairman Carl Levin, saying that there have been statements that the aircraft that crashed in Pennsylvania was shot down, added, "These stories continue to exist." Myers replied, "Mr. Chairman, the armed forces did not shoot down any aircraft." That same day, NORAD said, "Contrary to media reports that speculate that United Airlines Flight 93 was downed by a U.S. Fighter aircraft, NORAD allocated forces have not engaged with weapons any aircraft, including Flight 93. NORAD said that this should put an end to the rumors. But the rumors continued. In 2002, for example, Susan McElwain, who lived near the crash site, reported that within hours of the crash, she had received a call from a girlfriend who had said that her husband, who was in the Air Force, had called and said, "I can't talk because we've just shot a plane down." Although the 9/11 Commission did not directly acknowledge this controversy, it made a three-point argument to rule out the possibility that United 93 could have been shot down. The first argument was that the military did not know about the hijacking of United 93 until after it had crashed. As we have seen, there is much evidence against this claim. The second argument was that Cheney, having not arrived in the PEOC until almost 10 o'clock, did not give the shoot-down authorization until sometime after 10:10, and that Richard Clark, who had asked for this authorization, did not receive confirmation until 10:25. These claims were meant to rule out the possibility that United 93 was shot down because it came down at either 10:03 or 10:06. However, Clark himself indicated that he, after asking for the authorization shortly after 9:30, and he was then amazed at the speed of the decisions coming from Cheney, and he received the authorization between 9:45 and 9:50, not after 10:10. Also, a Newsday story published 2 weeks after 9/11 said that the authorization was given after Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, meaning about 9:38. In 2003, U.S. News and World Report wrote, Pentagon sources say that Bush communicated the order to shoot down any hijacked civilian airplane to Cheney almost immediately after Flight 77 hit the Pentagon. Colonel Robert Moore, the head of NEADS, said that he had passed that order on to the pilots so that United Airlines Flight 93 would not be allowed to reach Washington, D.C. So there was plenty of time for the plane to have been shot down, according to these sources. The Pentagon's third argument was that the military was not in position to shoot United 93 down. But a reporter in Nashua, which is where the Boston Aircraft Control Center actually is, wrote, FAA air traffic controllers in Nashua have learned through discussions with other controllers that the F-16 fighter stayed in hot pursuit of another hijacked commercial airliner until it crashed in Pennsylvania. Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz said, we responded awfully quickly, and in fact we were already tracking in on that plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. A CBS story then said U.S. officials were considering shooting down the hijacked airliner that crashed in western Pennsylvania, but it crashed first. Administration officials say that had the jetliner continued towards Washington, the fighter jets would have shot it down. Still other stories reporting that the military was in position to shoot United 93 down existed. So the claim by the military that the 9/11 Commission was simply not in position to do this has been strongly contradicted. The falsity of the official story about 93 is further suggested by descriptions of the alleged crash site. One television reporter said, there was just a big hole in the ground. All I saw was a crater filled with small, charred plane parts. Nothing that would even tell you that it was the plane. There were no suitcases, no recognizable plane parts, no body parts. A newspaper photographer said, I didn't think I was in the right place. I was looking for something that said tall, tail, wing, plane, metal. There was nothing. Debris, instead, was found many miles away, and much of it was debris that could not have blown there. John Flegel, an employee at Indian Lake Marina, reported that the debris that washed ashore included pieces of seats, small chunks of melted plastic, and checks. Newspapers reported that debris was found in New Baltimore, which was beyond a mountain ridge more than 8 miles from the alleged crash site. Also, although Flight 93 reportedly was carrying more than 37,000 gallons of fuel when it crashed, tests of soil and groundwater at the official crash site found no evidence of contamination. Perhaps the strangest feature of the crash site was that there were evidently 2 of them. According to CNN reporter Bryan Law, speaking from the official crash site, the FBI had cordoned off a second area about 6 to 8 miles away from the crater. He then asked, why would debris from the plane be located 6 miles away? Parallel to the evidence of 2 crash sites was evidence for 2 flight paths. According to the flight data recorder, the plane came in from the north, a path that was confirmed by some witnesses in the Shanksville area. But other residents reported that the plane came from the east, with people fishing at the Indian Lake Marina reporting that the plane flew right over the lake. Conclusion. My report shows that there are many anomalous features in the official stories of Flight 77 and 93. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Professor Griffin. We'll now move to questions and dialogue between Professor Griffin and our panelists. Professor Lee will begin the questioning.
Thank you once again for a lucid and detailed presentation of a series of facts, established facts. This is one topic that it seemed that you didn't address, which is the whole question of whether it was a missile or something other than 757 that hit the Pentagon. And I would argue that there's pretty persuasive evidence that it was not a 757 that hit the Pentagon, given Barbara Honegger's testimony of a couple of days ago, and the fact that witness after witness found an absence of airplane debris on the lawn in front of the Pentagon, where there should have been evidence of a aircraft with 150-foot wingspan and so on and so forth. So it may be that this is not a question that would even, since it wasn't raised in your presentation, but there is a persistent question on skeptics of the truth, 9/11 truth movement, saying, well, if it was a cruise missile, where is the 757? What became of the 757? I wondered whether you would even sort of venture some comments on that, Dr. Griffin.
Yes, thank you. Yes, there are obviously dozens of issues that I have not addressed in this brief report on American 77. This is taken largely from a chapter in my forthcoming book, which is a consensus approach to the Pentagon. And in that, I begin with the point that I stressed here. That is that regardless of what you might think about a 757 or no 757, and then various variations on a no 757 point, regardless of that, the most important point is that there is agreement that the official story is false. That the official story is that Flight 77 hit the Pentagon under the control of Al-Qaeda. And that this is far more important than the secondary question of what actually did hit the Pentagon. Now, that said, I spent a long time on that chapter discussing that issue, that secondary issue. I tried to do justice to the position of people who believe that it was a 757 and perhaps Flight 77. I will learn whether I did justice to their point. But then I spent even longer arguing that that there's much more evidence on the other side. And however, I concluded with the suggestion that neither side of that argument is likely to win the way. I mean, to win the others over. It's unlikely that it's going to become unanimous on one side or the other. And so it would be probably a helpful thing to just give up trying to win consensus on that point. And I make an analogy with the World Trade Center. There are questions about what actually hit the World Trade Center buildings. Was it actually the official flights? Or had they been switched so that drones were hitting? Some people have even argued that nothing hit the World Trade Center, that it was holograms or anything like that. But there's very little discussion of that. The main discussion within the 9/11 Truth movement is about the evidence that explosives are what destroyed the Pentagon, regardless of what the planes were. So why not do the same thing with regard to the Pentagon? The main thing is what did not happen. That is, it wasn't under Al-Qaeda's control. And it doesn't matter so much on those questions. So I try to hold a both-and position. On the one hand, the one question is far more important, that there is consensus about that point. The planes were not hit under the control. Whatever damaged the Pentagon, it was not Al-Qaeda. And then the secondary point, sure, we can go on and discuss what really did happen, what kind of planes or whatever damaged the Pentagon. We can talk about that, but let's not take it as being so serious as many had assumed thus far. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Professor Johnson.
Thank you, Dr. Griffin. Wouldn't it be necessary for for officials or controllers attached to the two airlines to be in collusion with whoever took the planes over? Has anybody investigated or asked who would be in charge in the airlines and have responsibility for that?
You know, I think that would be a good secondary or tertiary question to raise, and by a grand jury or a special investigator. But I wouldn't see that as an important task for the 9/11 Truth movement to try to answer that question.
Professor Jenkins.
Dr. Griffin, do you know how many alleged communications, or excuse me, not alleged communications, recorded communications, there were altogether from all 4 flights, or communications from, that is, excuse me, communications from passengers or from hijackers, all 4 flights? How many altogether?
How many reported?
Recorded.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, it's not a high number. I haven't actually counted. We've in the past said that there were 13 or 14 from Flight 93 alone. There were not many from the others. You know, 1, 2, or 3 from the others. So it's not a very big number, and that's a point that I do make in my chapter in the new book about the alleged flights, calls from the flights.
And is it your view that whatever this number actually turns out to be, let's say something on the order of a dozen, all of them were faked?
That's my view. And I present some evidence for that, and then I give the argument that I've given, that if one was called, then they faked. They must have all been probably faked. But you know, don't have any good evidence. And there were the 2 flights calls from 93 that were The only two flights, incidentally, that the 9/11 Commission, and because the 9/11 Commission didn't tell people clearly what they believed about it. It looked like they were affirming these phone calls from cell phones, and actually they weren't. They had gotten the later report from the FBI. So what it ended out to be that there was only 2 cell phone calls from all 4 flights. There were considered only 2 cell phone calls because those were the 2 that were made when Flight 93 was, and I'm giving the official story, was crashing, going down, and it was low enough that cell phone calls might have been possible. It was still pretty high for cell phone calls, but they did state those. So there are all those issues. So it's a very confusing
I'm
issue.
sure you know that some critics have raised the question of how it would be possible to obtain enough foreknowledge, enough voice samples, and enough knowledge of what these alleged communicators would say to people that they're very closely attached to, that having that amount of foreknowledge, the voice samples of all these recorded calls, and having the kind of intimate knowledge about what would be appropriate to say to such a person is improbable. You have a comment on that position?
I do discuss that in my chapter, and of course it's something one can't go through and summarize very quickly. But yes, the issue has been discussed by people who have worked on this issue for several years, and have concluded that yes, indeed, it was entirely possible, and there's no reason even to think of it as improbable.
I think they point out, the critics, that some of these people made the decision to board one of these flights quite late, and you would have to have considerable foreknowledge to get a sample of the voice which would allow you to morph it.
Yeah, and this is another issue where we are dependent on the FBI and the 9/11 Commission for information about such things.
Right.
So we don't really know what really happened on such issues.
Can I follow up? Oh, go ahead.
Could I hear from
I want to
Judge
follow up.
Imposimato and then
No,
Professor
it's
Lee?
not following up on this point, so perhaps
Yeah.
you should go.
Oh, okay.
I guess the interesting, and I think Professor Jenkins raises an intriguing and important point, but the prior, or the point that I think would take priority is it's physically impossible to make those calls from aircraft flying at not even 40,000 feet, at 10,000 feet. And so then there's actually no other possible explanation except that there was fake.
Yeah, we have to keep the two issues distinct there, cell phone calls and then passenger seat. So the FBI has now agreed implicitly that those high altitude cell phone calls were impossible. So they do not endorse any of those. So it's only the two calls that were down at what it was, I think, 5,000 feet. Still pretty high, but
Yeah.
possible. So the other issue is when they shifted over to those various calls that had initially been thought to be cell phone calls, then is there an argument that those calls did not go through, did not actually occur? And the issue that I've raised today, I think is most important, is their change of the story on Tom Burnett because the evidence is simply so strong. I mean, I don't think there's any way to deny that Dina Burnett said that she got those calls, 3 to 4 calls, from her husband, and that she knew that this was from his cell phone because she had the caller ID. So nobody has questioned that. The FBI does not question that. They just ignore that. They just ignore her testimony now and just say, oh no, it was from a passenger seat phone. So I take that as the strongest evidence that that the calls were faked.
Did you have?
A final question. Could you help me out? I'm puzzled about feasible motivation for the government to both shoot down United 93 and to deny that it shot it down. It seems to me that they had a moral justification to take that plane down. They would have shown at least some confidence in their attempt to prevent further destruction and loss of life, more excessive than the passengers on Flight 93. Why would they deny shooting it down?
That's a very strong argument, I believe, and many people have made that argument. Say, well, why in the world deny it? Why not prove that when they finally got their act together, they
Right.
were ready to shoot them down? But for some reason, they have denied. The FBI and the military and the 9/11 Commission have denied that they shot the plane down. This is another question where we don't really know what was going on. They probably had, quite likely had very good reasons for denying it even. And what really happened? I mean, the two different, apparently two different flights. So I just conclude that it's impossible for us, with the information that we have been allowed to have, it's impossible for us to decide, make a rational judgment about what really happened there, and therefore why they would have done this or that. So that all that we can say, I think with certainty, is that the official story is false.
Thank you.
Judge Imposimato.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Thank you for your clear statement. You have told, it seems to me, that FIF...
Can you please move the microphone a little closer?
You have told, it seems to me, that FIF informed the NORAD military institution and the Pentagon right after the first attack to Twin Towers at about 8:30. So United States Army could have the possibility to react suddenly, avoiding the attack to the Pentagon. The question is, there should have been an intentional inert behavior by somebody that was interested to provoke the attack. Who should have given the order to the attack, Dick Cheney or George Bush? It is clear what I...
Can anybody repeat
You have
the
spoken
main
about
point?
the inert before after the attack to Twin Towers, 8:30. The FIF informed immediately NORAD and Pentagon about the attack of Twin Towers. So you say, I think that it is correct, that the Pentagon, U.S. Army, would have had the possibility to react immediately in order to avoid the attack to the Pentagon before the order that it was after 10 o'clock in the morning. So I ask you, this inert behavior was of Mr. Dick Cheney or other somebody inside the Pentagon?
I think the question, if I may try to rephrase it, the question has to do with the evidence that the military authorities received information in good time, and therefore, do you think it likely that, or who would, to whom would you assign responsibility for the inert response of the air defense system, to Vice President Cheney or to some other person? Is that correct?
Yes,
Yes.
Thank
this
you.
is-
Yes, taking the official story to be true, we've already had 2 attacks on the World Trade Center. So it's very clear, given the official, if what we were told was happening, what was really happening, America was under attack. Well, the chance that anybody could then succeed in attacking the Pentagon is just impossible. Nobody would be asleep at the wheel at that moment. And given the official story, you had about 40 minutes of it coming from the Midwest, coming back to Washington to hit the Pentagon. And so they just tell lies and say, well, we had no evidence that Flight 77 was coming back, or we didn't know the Pentagon was going to be attacked, even though it was in those days called Ground Zero. They really considered that the Pentagon was the place that terrorists would want to attack. So the official story is just false. Now, but assuming that something like that occurred, whose responsibility? Well, certainly Cheney, but the whole group that was planning the attacks. So you couldn't assign it in particular to Cheney or to General Myers. The stories they tell are just so outrageous. Richard Clarke wrote this book, and it became a best-selling book while the 9/11 Commission was having its hearings. So people were reading that book. Certainly the 9/11 Commission read Cheney's book and would have known exactly, Clarke's book, yeah. They would have known exactly what he said. They never made a reference to to Clarke's book. The whole 9/11 Commission does not mention Clarke's book because he says forbidden things. He said that Rumsfeld and General Myers were both participating in this video conference that Clarke was running from the White House. And he gives the conversations he had with Rumsfeld, the conversations that he had with the general. So that was all published before the 9/11 Commission gave its report. Nevertheless, it just contradicts those things that Clarke said. And they said Rumsfeld was just in his office. He was talking to a CIA briefer, and he had no idea what was going on. And he didn't have any ideas until there was a strike on the Pentagon. And so he went down to see what happened. And likewise, the general, rather than participating in the video conference from the Pentagon's video conference center, he was up on Capitol Hill doing preparation for his. It's a whole group of people. It's a totally false story. And so everybody involved in that would be, in that sense, equally guilty of whatever happened.
Yes, Professor Lee.
Yeah.
Could
Go ahead.
it be possible? Excuse me.
I'm sorry, we can return to Judge Imposamanto, but Professor Lee, would you like to pose your question?
I'd like to pose a question coming back to the cell phone
Oh,
question.
well, perhaps we could have a follow-up from Judge Impossimato then, and then return to the other subject.
Could it be a question of simple mistake due to the confusion, or could it be possible that Mr. Cheney or other behavior is connected with the Iraq War, with the possibility to create a casus belli, cioè to justify the Iraq War. Excuse me, but I suppose this, because your analysis is very clear, but we have to get conclusion of your perfect analysis. That I agree on your analysis. So this inert behavior is been intentional or due to mistake, to confusion.
Yeah. No, in my books, I've provided evidence that certainly this group that involved Cheney and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and quite a group had been wanting an attack on Iraq since the early 90s. They were writing public letters to Clinton begging him to attack Iraq. For one reason or another, this attack was not allowed until after 9/11 and the Bush-Cheney administration was in office. We've also already had evidence presented here that they wanted the war in Afghanistan, and certainly as early as July, the decision had been made to attack Afghanistan. Now, there was evidently some debate within the group, within this circle, whether to go to Iraq first or Afghanistan. And General Powell said, "That's crazy. We can't attack Iraq first because." Paraphrasing here, our story is that the attack was led by Osama bin Laden and in Afghanistan. So we have to go to Afghanistan first. Then, after that, after, say, a decent interval, we can attack Iraq.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're a little over time, but we can have one quick question from
Yes.
Professor Lee and
Okay.
a concise response.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would be intrigued to have Dr. Griffin's comments on the following question. What could explain conspirators' choice of faking cell phone calls when such calls could be so easily refutable?
There are many signs that the people who organized this total effort that we call 9/11, the 9/11 attacks, some of them were not terribly bright. An example is the claim that the hijackers were wearing red headbands. And I present the evidence in this for a fellow who had been in Afghanistan for a very long time, that it was only Sunni. I mean, it was not Sunni. It was Shia that would wear the red. So Sunni would not have been wearing red. So whoever decided to have them described as wearing red was not a very bright fellow. So it seemed like there was a lot of that going on. But, given the control of the media, they're able to clean it up. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Griffin, for your testimony.